My daughter-in-law was filming me while I set the table, and she posted the video with the caption, "Our live-in maid." At least she's good for something. My son didn't defend me. He simply reacted with a laughing emoji. I didn't argue. I just left. The next morning, her card was declined at the grocery store. That was the first thing I took back. By the end of the week, she was going to learn the difference between living in my house and owning it. I was folding white napkins beside the plates. The Sunday pot roast rested on the counter, filling the kitchen with its warm, savory aroma. My daughter-in-law, Tara, stood in the doorway with her phone pointed directly at me. At first, I assumed she was recording the nicely arranged table. Then I heard her voice loud and clear. "Our live-in maid. At least she's good for something." She laughed softly and tapped her screen. I froze in the middle of folding a napkin. Our eyes met, but she only shrugged and walked away. A few minutes later, I sat down in the kitchen and opened the app on my phone. The video was already posted. The caption was exactly what she had said. Then I noticed a notification showing that my son Derek had commented. Just one crying, laughing emoji. I didn't feel a sharp pain in my chest. Instead, I felt a strange, icy clarity settle over me. To them, I wasn't family anymore. I was free labor. A year earlier, they had moved into the upstairs bedrooms so they could save money for a house of their own. Since then, I had quietly taken responsibility for almost everything in the household. I stood up, took my coat from the hook, picked up my purse, and walked out without saying a word. I locked the front door gently behind me, got into my car, and drove to a small bed and breakfast on the edge of town. I needed space. I didn't cry. I just thought. The next morning, I sat on the little balcony outside my room with a cup of coffee. The winter sun shone brightly overhead. My phone buzzed on the wooden table. A text from Tara appeared. Why was my card declined? I'm standing here with a full card at checkout. It was the extra debit card I had given her for shared grocery expenses. Without hesitation, I opened my banking app and confirmed what I had done the night before. The card was already blocked. I didn't answer. I set the phone aside, breathed in the cold morning air, and cut into my croissant. Seconds later, the phone rang again. Around noon, I drove home. The moment I unlocked the front door, I heard quick footsteps in the hallway. Tara stood there with her arms crossed and her face flushed. "What the hell was that this morning?" she snapped. "I looked like an idiot at the register. Did you forget to raise the limit or something?" Calmly, I removed my coat and hung it up. "No," I said evenly. I canceled the card. Derek stepped out of the living room looking exhausted the way he always did whenever conflict appeared. "Mom, you can't just do that. How are we supposed to shop?" I turned toward him. "With your own money, Derek. That card was meant for occasional purchases, not for covering your everyday expenses while you live here rent-free. I'm not carrying that anymore." I held out my hand. "I'd like the card back now." Tara huffed, dug through her purse, and tossed the plastic card onto the entry table. "All this drama over one stupid video. It was just a joke for my friends." "It was your idea of a joke," I replied matter-of-factly. "And this is my card. I don't need the jokes, and you don't need my card." I walked past them and into the kitchen. Instead of preparing the large family lunch I usually made, I heated a single bowl of soup, sat at the small kitchen table, and ate alone. Derek lingered in the doorway, clearly waiting for me to ask whether he wanted some. I continued eating in silence. After a few minutes, he turned around and left. That afternoon, I sorted laundry. Normally, I carried their baskets down to the basement myself. This time, I left Tara and Derek's basket exactly where it sat in the hallway. Later, while reading on the sofa, my eyes kept drifting toward the kitchen shelves. Tomorrow, even more was going to change. The next 2 days passed in an unexpectedly peaceful silence. I cooked only for myself, loaded only my dishes into the dishwasher, and cleaned only the surfaces I personally used. On Wednesday morning, Derek appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a wrinkled blue shirt. "Mom, you haven't done the laundry yet. I need this shirt for a meeting this afternoon." I looked up from my newspaper and took a sip of tea. "Your laundry basket is still upstairs in the hall, Derek. The washing machine in the basement is available. You know how to use it." He blinked in confusion. But you always do it on Wednesdays for all of us. Tara doesn't have time. She's got her workout class later. I'm retired, Derek, but I'm not hired help. If Tara has time for the gym, she has time to run a washing machine. Or you can do it yourself. I turned the page. He sighed dramatically, muttered something under his breath, and stomped toward the basement. Later, I heard Tara complaining loudly upstairs. She came down, ignored me completely, and slammed the front door behind her. It was a small victory, but an important one. For the first time, they were beginning to understand that my help was not automatic. That afternoon, I walked through the house and really paid attention to how much of my space they had gradually claimed. Tara's glossy magazines were scattered across my coffee table. Derek's sneakers blocked the entryway, and empty mugs seemed to appear in every room downstairs. They treated the entire main floor as though it belonged to them, while I kept retreating further and further into the background. That ended that day. I gathered the magazine's shoes and coffee mugs into a large basket and carried everything upstairs, setting it neatly outside their bedroom door. Then I dragged my old wingback chair out of the guest room and placed it in the best spot in the living room directly beside the large front window. When I finally settled into it with my book and looked out at the yard, the room felt like mine again. A little while later, I heard a key turn in the lock. Tara stepped inside, stopped in the living room doorway, and stared. I was sitting comfortably in my wingback chair with my feet up, reading peacefully. "What's that old chair doing here?" she asked sharply. "It doesn't even match the couch. We wanted the living room light and modern." "We," I replied calmly without looking up from my book. "This is my house, Tara. I like the chair by the window. And I put your things in a basket outside your door. From now on, please keep them in your own rooms." She opened her mouth as if she wanted to argue, then closed it again and stomped upstairs. A minute later, I heard her on the phone. Her voice carried through the floorboard, shrill and angry, though I couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. I finished my chapter, put my book aside, and headed out to the garden to tend the rose beds. That evening, Derek came into the kitchen while I was making myself a sandwich. The tension in the house had become impossible to ignore. He stood there, nervously running a hand through his hair. "Mom, Tara's really upset. Can't you cut her some slack? We all live here together." I set down the knife and looked at him. "Exactly, Derek. We do live here together. But you're my guests, and neither of you pays rent. I've been cutting slack for an entire year. Now I'm finally keeping some for myself." He shifted uncomfortably and avoided my eyes. "We were actually going to talk to you about summer vacation. You always help with the travel fund. We found this great beach house." I wiped the knife clean and placed it back in the drawer. "Not this year. I'm keeping my money for myself. I have a few renovations planned around the house." His eyes widened immediately. "But we were counting on that. Without your part, we can't afford it." "Then you'll need to choose something smaller," I replied kindly as I picked up my plate. The next morning, I called a handyman. He arrived promptly at 8 o'clock while Derek and Tara were still asleep upstairs. I wasn't planning a major remodel. I didn't need a new kitchen or bathroom. What I wanted was much simpler. I wanted privacy. Lately, Tara had developed the habit of walking into my rooms whenever she felt like it. She borrowed hand cream without asking, searched through drawers looking for wrapping paper, and often used my office as a place to temporarily dump things she didn't want cluttering her own space. Little by little, my privacy had disappeared. By mid-morning, the handyman had installed sturdy new locks on both my bedroom door and my home office door. When he handed me the 2 new sets of keys, I thanked him, paid him in cash, and immediately locked my office. Then I slipped the key into my pocket. Around 10 o'clock, Tara finally wandered downstairs and poured herself a cup of coffee. A few moments later, I heard the handle of my office door rattle. Then it rattled again, and again. "Is this door stuck?" she called out. I leaned casually against the kitchen doorway. "No, it's locked." She spun around and stared at me. "Locked. Why? Because it's my private space," I answered calmly. "I don't want either of you going into my rooms without asking any more. Your area is upstairs." She let out a short laugh. "That's ridiculous. We're family. What are you hiding in there anyway? My peace and quiet." Without waiting for a response, I turned back to unloading the dishwasher. A few seconds later, I heard her stomp back upstairs. I knew Derek would probably try to smooth things over that evening, but there was nothing to smooth over. There were simply new rules, and those rules were becoming very clear. The next one involved the garage. That afternoon, I put on a pair of sturdy shoes and opened the large garage door. Sunlight spilled across a wall of moving boxes, unused furniture, sports equipment, and miscellaneous belongings. When they had moved in, they promised all of it would be sorted out quickly. That promise had never been kept. For months, my own car had sat outside in the rain while their unused possessions occupied every inch of covered space. I wheeled out a small cart from the garden shed and got to work. Box by box, chair by chair, piece by piece, I moved everything beneath the large covered carport in the backyard. Nothing would be damaged by weather, but it would no longer occupy my garage. 3 hours later, I swept the floor clean, got into my car, and parked it directly in the center of the garage. As the automatic door closed behind me, the soft mechanical hum sounded strangely satisfying. For the first time in months, the space was serving its original purpose again. When Derek got home from work and saw the stacks of boxes outside, he marched straight into the living room. "Mom, why is all our stuff outside? It can't stay there." I looked up from the old photographs I was sorting. "You're right, it can't. You'll need to move it into the attic or get rid of it this weekend. I need my garage back for my car." "But we don't have time this weekend," he said in frustration. "We're going to a birthday party." "That's unfortunate," I replied evenly. "Then you'll have to take care of it tonight after work. The carport is only a temporary solution." He stared at me as though he barely recognized the woman sitting in front of him. The version of me who quietly fixed every inconvenience and constantly made room for everyone else was gone. In her place was someone calmly expecting adults to take responsibility for their own lives. The next morning, I watched Tara angrily shove a trash bag into the bin outside. Neither of them spoke to me. That was perfectly fine. For the first time in a very long while, the silence felt peaceful. Sunday mornings had always been my favorite. The house was usually quiet. The sunlight came through the kitchen windows just right, and I could enjoy a peaceful breakfast before the day properly began. That Sunday, the moment I walked into the kitchen, I knew something was different. The refrigerator looked noticeably emptier. I opened the door and immediately saw what was missing. My favorite cheese was gone. So was my yogurt. The fresh rolls I had bought the day before had disappeared as well. In their place sat a small note written in Tara's unmistakable handwriting. "We decided to keep our food strictly separate since you want everything separate now. We took some of yours this morning because we hadn't shopped yet. We'll settle it later." I smiled to myself. The note was such an obvious attempt to provoke an argument that it almost felt childish. Instead of reacting, I got dressed and went for a long walk. By the time I returned late that morning, Derek and Tara had completely taken over the kitchen. They were making scrambled eggs, occupying every bit of counter space and deliberately ignoring me. I didn't say a word. Instead, I walked into my office, opened my laptop, and ordered a small refrigerator. It arrived the very next day. The delivery team carried it directly into my office and set it up exactly where I wanted it. That afternoon, I drove to the gourmet market and bought fresh salmon-quality cheese vegetables and a bottle of white wine. When I got home, I stocked my new refrigerator, closed the office door behind me, and locked it. That evening, Derek and Tara came home hungry. A few moments later, I heard the refrigerator door downstairs open, then close, then open again. "Mom, didn't you go shopping?" Derek called out. I stepped into the hallway and looked at him calmly. "You wanted everything separate. I thought that was an excellent idea. I shopped for myself. My food stays in my room from now on." Tara appeared behind him, her expression hardening. "You're keeping food in your room." "Only my food," I replied. "You're adults. I'm sure you'll figure things out." Then I turned around and walked away. But that wasn't the real test. The real test arrived that weekend. It was Friday evening, and I was sitting in my wingback chair enjoying a glass of wine when I heard car doors outside. Looking through the window, I saw Tara's parents walking up the driveway with 2 rolling suitcases. No one had mentioned they were coming. No one had asked. Tara opened the front door with a bright smile, while Derek stood nearby looking uncomfortable. "Come on in. Make yourselves comfortable. The guest room is right here," I heard her say cheerfully. I remained seated. I already knew what was about to happen. A few moments later, Tara marched toward the guest room door and turned the handle. Nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. The door was locked. Her smile vanished instantly. She turned toward me. "Did you lock this door?" "Yes," I said calmly as I stood and greeted her parents. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Hayes. It's nice to see you. Did you have a good drive?" They nodded politely, though they clearly seemed confused. Tara stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Open the door. My parents are staying the entire weekend. Where are they supposed to sleep?" I looked at her calmly. "You should have asked me first, Tara. The guest room isn't available anymore." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean it isn't available? I turned it into a craft room. You can't be serious. You invited guests without discussing it with me," I replied evenly. "I'm not sending anyone away. You have plenty of space upstairs, including a pull-out couch. I'm sure your parents will be perfectly comfortable there." The room fell silent. Derek's face turned bright red. Tara's parents stared awkwardly at the floor. Without saying another word, Derek picked up the suitcases and carried them upstairs. Tara shot me a furious look before following him. The matter was settled. The weekend passed quietly after that. For the most part, Tara's parents either stayed upstairs or spent their days out exploring. The pull-out couch clearly wasn't nearly as comfortable as the guest room had been, but no one raised the issue again. On Sunday afternoon, they offered me a polite but noticeably cool goodbye before leaving. The moment their car disappeared down the street, Derek walked out to the garden where I was trimming hydrangeas. "Mom, what happened Friday was really awkward," he said. "Tara's been crying. She's furious. You could have at least warned us." I set down the gardening shears and looked directly at him. "Funny thing about warnings, Derek. You and Tara have been living here like this is a hotel and I'm the staff. You use the electricity, the water, the heat, and an awful lot of my patience." Then I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a folded envelope. "That's over." I handed it to him. He accepted it cautiously. "What's this, a standard rental agreement?" I said. "For the upstairs. Fair market rent for the square footage plus your share of utilities. It starts on the 1st of next month." His expression changed immediately. "Rent, but we're saving for a house. If we pay rent here, it'll take years longer. Then you'll need to adjust your plans just like every other adult." I picked up my shears again. "Read it carefully. If you sign it, I'll be happy to have you as tenants. If not, you have 3 months to find somewhere else to live." For the first time since all of this began, I saw genuine understanding settle across his face. There was no argument, no negotiation, no appeal to guilt, just a clear boundary. And for the first time, he realized I meant every word. The next few days passed beneath a layer of tense silence. There were no dramatic confrontations, no slammed doors, and no angry speeches. Derek and Tara moved through the house almost quietly, leaving for work in the morning and returning in the evening with as little interaction as possible. Meanwhile, I spent my time reading, taking long walks, tending my garden, and setting up the craft room that had once been the guest room. Thursday evening brought a gentle knock on my office door. When I opened it, Derek stood there holding the envelope I'd given him several days earlier. He looked tired, but there was something different about him. For the first time in a long while, he seemed less defensive and more thoughtful. "We signed it," he said quietly as he handed the paperwork back to me. I accepted the envelope and glanced down at the signatures. He shifted his weight before continuing. "We get it, Mom. We'll pay the rent on time. And I'm sorry. About the video. About all of it." For a moment, I simply looked at him. I didn't rush forward to hug him, nor did I pretend everything had suddenly been fixed. Some things take time. Still, I appreciated that he had finally said the words. "Thank you, Derek," I replied. "That's a good start." He nodded slowly. "We're still looking for our own place," he added. "Tara thinks it'll be better if we have our own household." Completely. "I think that's a very smart decision," I answered honestly. A brief silence followed before he gave me a small nod and walked away. I closed the door gently behind him. Over the next several weeks, the atmosphere inside the house changed. Our interactions remained polite but distant, and for the first time since moving in, Tara stopped treating me like an unpaid employee. They bought their own groceries, handled their own laundry, cleaned up after themselves, and paid the rent exactly as agreed. Life became remarkably peaceful. Months passed quickly. Boxes began appearing upstairs, first one or two at a time, then entire stacks lining the hallway. Little by little, they packed up the life they had built inside my home. There were no arguments about the move, and no attempts to renegotiate our arrangement. The reality had finally settled in. 4 months later, they moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't the dream house they had been saving for. It wasn't a beach property or a luxury development. It was simply a place they could afford on their own. On moving day, Derek handed me the keys to the upstairs portion of the house. The exchange was brief, respectful, and surprisingly calm. After the moving truck disappeared down the street, I walked through the upstairs rooms by myself. The space was quiet, clean, and empty. For a few moments, I stood in the center of the hallway listening to the silence. The next morning, I made breakfast, carried my plate and coffee into the living room, and settled into my wingback chair by the window. Sunlight streamed across the floor, warming the room as I looked around. There were no shoes blocking the hallway, no abandoned mugs sitting on tables, no expectation that lunch would magically appear because someone else was hungry. There was only peace. I took a sip of coffee, leaned back in my chair, and felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years settle over me. I wasn't the maid. I wasn't the unpaid cook. I wasn't the housekeeper, chauffeur, laundry service, travel fund, or personal assistant. I was simply myself sitting in my own home. Looking back, I realized that Tara had believed calling me the maid would put me in my place. Instead, it had forced me to remember exactly whose place it was. The house, the debit card, the groceries, the laundry room, the garage, and even the guest room had never belonged to them. I had simply allowed them to benefit from my generosity for so long that they began mistaking it for an obligation. In the end, I never threw them out in anger. I gave them something far more useful: rules, responsibility, boundaries, and eventually, rent. Those things accomplished what arguments never could. As I sat quietly in the morning sunlight with a warm cup of coffee in my hands, I finally understood something that had taken me far too many years to learn. Respect is not something you beg for inside your own home. Sometimes it begins with a locked door. 6 months later, the house felt completely different. The upstairs was quiet again. I had turned one of the rooms into a sewing space and another into a small reading room filled with plants and sunlight. Most mornings I sat in my wingback chair with a cup of coffee and watched the garden wake up outside the window. Derek called every few weeks. Our conversations were never long, but they were honest. He and Tara were adjusting to apartment life, paying their own bills, managing their own household, and learning lessons that no one else could learn for them. Looking back, I don't think the video was really the problem. It simply revealed a truth that had been growing inside this house for a long time. Somewhere along the way, my kindness had become an expectation instead of a gift. The good thing about boundaries is that they don't just teach other people how to treat you. They remind you how to value yourself. As I looked around my quiet living room, I felt grateful for everything that had changed. The house was peaceful. My days were my own, and the life I had built finally belonged to me again. Sometimes respect doesn't return because people suddenly change. Sometimes it returns because you stop giving it away for free.
This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life situations that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. While the characters and events have been shaped for storytelling, the emotions, conflicts, and choices reflect truths that exist in everyday life. At Quiet Revenge Stories channel, every story is created to explore the complexity of human relationships, especially the difficult moments that test trust boundaries and self-worth. These stories are not just about drama, but about awareness, resilience, and the courage it takes to protect yourself when it matters most. The message behind our stories is simple, but powerful. Love should never require you to lose yourself, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Life will sometimes place you in situations where you must choose between keeping peace and protecting your dignity, and in those moments, choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of something real, consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Quiet Revenge Stories channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson, a reflection, or a truth worth hearing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.